Now that we've created some clouds, as well as moved into the world of clipping masks and added some details, we've got some depth into our painting, but not enough just yet. We want to look at some useful tools inside of Photoshop to give the illusion of yet more depth or even more realism. Allow me to introduce you to the blur effect inside of Photoshop. Whenever you take a photo using a camera, you would always have a point of focus, and everything that is out of focus would be slightly blurred. This is the nature of photography. And even in reality, when your eye focuses on a particular object, everything in the periphery is out of focus or blurred. We want to recreate that realism, that illusion inside of our painting. How we achieve this is by blurring. The blur effect would only, in fact, impart on a particular focus. For instance, if my focus is this table where my cursor is hovering, then everything outside of this focus would be slightly blurred. I'm talking about this bed here, the lamp, this lamp right here, the bed, chimneys, clouds, and background. Those would be out of focus or blurred. So let's begin with this extreme foreground to start. This bed right here. I would duplicate this layer by pressing Ctrl J, and I would get a duplicate copy number 2. I will just erase that suffix, and to its subsequent layer I will just add the suffix underscore BLUR, blur. For this blurred layer, if I disable it and enable it, I just have the base color. No details, no shadows, no highlights, nothing. But I don't need to have shadows or highlights. What I need for a blur is the edges. After all, when you blur a particular object, you don't really focus on the detail. You just focus on its outline and how it seems a little bit out of focus. So with the blur layer selected, I would go into my filter inside of my menu and then scroll down towards blur. There are several options here. You can go with the default blur. However, I prefer the Gaussian blur. There's a lot of documentation about which blur does what. But in my experience, the Gaussian blur works well for me. Inside of the Gaussian blur window, which is quite limited, I would zoom out until I find my particular object, and I would adjust the radius of my blur. See that I have my bed and pillow selected. I would increase the radius to a value that I see fit. And when the preview option is enabled, I get to see the outcome. I don't think I want that much blur. About 2 would do. I'd say okay. And when I enable the duplicate sharp layer, I now have this halo of a blur around it. So it's not as focused as it should be. Let's do this with the foliage here. With the middle ground foliage, I'll do the same thing. I already have a blur in place. That's why I have this soft halo here. But let me delete that so that I can recreate it. Control J. I'm mindful to always keep my blur layer underneath my base. Let's try a motion blur this time around. Motion blur, as opposed to the Gaussian blur, in my experience, has a bit of a translate to it, so you can change the angle of the motion. Let's say you have a picture captured in motion and you were translating horizontally. Let's say your camera was panning, in other words. In the event that your camera was panning, chances are that you would have a bit of a motion blur that would see one edge blurrier than the other. That is a motion blur. You would adjust the distance of this blur accordingly. And then you have your blurry edge around your base form. Ultimately, as I had said, this gives a illusion or adds on to the illusion of depth, giving one point of focus, which could be this table and its surrounding props, and every other object or property is blurred out of view. This is dependent on your resource image. My resource image was in fact quite sharp, so I wouldn't need so much blur. However, there are instances where you would be painting from a resource that had a very sharp focus. Let's look at this image from Kimi no Nawa. You would see that the books in the extreme foreground are very blurry. There's even a lens glare effect where my mouse is hovering over. Yet, in contrast, objects in the middle ground are very sharp and clear. Objects in the extreme background are blurry. So that's a consideration when you are creating yet more detail in your painting. Finally, when your details have come to pass, we want to take a recap. You must observe caution when you are painting objects that are obscured fully or partially by your layer masks. When you're selecting colors from objects that are obscured by the layer masks, you will inevitably select a bit of that atmosphere. What I mean by that is, let's try selecting a color here from your lamp and try to add some detail to it. Right now you can see the colors I've selected are both within the purple-ish hue. But when you disable your atmospheric effects, such as your sun and your clouds, it turns out that your painting was in fact a deep, rich, brownish hue. Almost red. So understand when you are painting, where does your atmosphere affect? And if possible, paint without the atmosphere while continuously toggling it on and off. That's one thing you have to be very, very careful about. Your atmosphere does change the color of all of its subsequent layers. I encourage you to experiment again with your blend modes. To be specific, when you're dealing with your shadows, try to use darken, multiply, difference. And when you are working with your highlights, try to use screen, overlay, soft light, or lighten. There's going to be a YouTube tutorial on Gaussian blur, as well as other blurring effects. And here we have my final painting. Of course, a lot more detail has been added on. You may think that my sketch is enabled. It's not. I've just added more depth and more detail. A bit of effect here and there to add some glow to my lamps. And here I have my sketch enabled. As I said before, try and paint until the sketch is no longer necessary, until you make it redundant, until you've added so much detail that you have essentially differentiated one form from the other.